Since the vending machines are still stocked, I guess it's okay to drink here, and I can take off my mask for at least for a little bit. Here's to part 2 of the King Jeongjo Cradle to Grave tour and to the end of COVID-19. This northern part of the palace has the last 2 imprints from the colonial period and the old park Changgyeonggung. Joseon rulers used to maintain rice paddies here as a personal link to the land and the harvest. The long-term restoration plan actually calls for restoring those paddies and Jahyun, Lady Hyegyeong's private residence. The lake that Japanese landscapers made in 1909 included a quaint Korean-style tea house on the far shore called the Crystal Palace, Sujeonggung. Chundangji-pan got this much more Chosun look with a round island at its center in 1986. In the colonial period, Japanese administrators also planted thousands of cherry trees along the lines of Tokyo's Ueno Park. The cherry blossom festival here was huge up until the 1980s when the trees were removed, but Seoulites can still see the blossoms every spring, only now on Yeouido by the National Assembly. The Grand Greenhouse Daeseonshil was the largest in Asia when completed in 1909. Korea's last emperor commissioned the greenhouse, that's why it was allowed to stay on the grounds. And for proof of that, you can see this repeated motif on the roof ridge. Those are plum blossoms, the emblem of the House of Yi. According to Harvard professor Ian Miller, the zoo, museums, and botanical garden in Tokyo's Ueno Park had the purpose of putting Imperial Japan on the level of those societies in 1900 that were capable of collecting, classifying, and studying all life on Earth. This greenhouse held rare flora from around the world. It's closed now because of coronavirus, but after liberation, all foreign specimens were removed and replaced with indigenous plants. If Imperial Japan wanted to denigrate Chosun by building new structures beside old palace halls, Korea's controversial strongman Park Chung-hee wanted to prove anything Imperial Japan could do, the Republic of Korea could do bigger and better. In 1962, a cable car his government put in started carrying spectators over the pond. Notice the colonial-era tea house. It was razed and replaced with this restaurant in 1969. That year, the park got extensive expansions as part of its Hwangap, or 60th anniversary. 2 giant glass domes look down on the old greenhouse. The zoo got around 200 more animals and big open enclosures. And amusement park rides filled any space that was empty. A Korean who visited Changgyeonggung back then told me it was the place to go, later adding, it was the only place to go. Apart from King Sejong and Admiral Yi Sun-shin, tourist material rarely mentioned Chosun rulers in the 1960s to 80s. Sado, however, did appear on occasion, depicted as emblematic of the factionalism that tore Chosun and later Korea apart. Scholars have described how Park Chung-hee's increasing dictatorial powers and push to modernize after 1973 drove democracy activists to call for more freedom and greater appreciation of Korea's own culture. That could be why Korean red pines, sonamu, now dominate Changgyeonggung's grounds and not cherry trees. Before Park was assassinated in 1979, his government made plans to move the whole menagerie, the zoo, botanical garden, amusement park rides, and the cable car, to what is now Seoul Grand Park in the mid-1980s. Military leaders wanted to be seen as the primary defenders and promoters of true Korean culture and increased the number of attractions ahead of their bid for the 1988 Summer Olympics. Seoul Grand Park even got a museum like the original Palace Park, but this time the emphasis was on modern art. When Changgyeonggung closed for restoration in the 1980s, every trace of the authoritarian-era additions and the original zoo were removed. The old Prince Yi Museum Royal Archive building was demolished in 1992, after Kim Il-sung was elected president. Civilian governments have pushed Chosun's restoration a lot further. Besides Sado's shrine, seen in part 1, a land bridge reconnecting the palace and Jeongmyo Shrine is almost complete. These days, reenactments are breathing Chosun life back into the restored palace. weather and virus protection permitting. I've seen a lavish ceremony here in the main courtyard, where an 8-year-old Sado served his father King Jeongjo wine at his 50th birthday celebration. I witnessed King Jeongjo visit Gyeongchuncheon over there to congratulate Lady Hyegyeong on the birth of the future King Jeongjo. These reenactments are very well done. Still, Lady Hyegyeong's written accounts are more vivid. Things like Sado trying to kill himself by jumping into a well like this one. All of his attempts were foiled by his loyal servants. In her memoirs, Lady Hyegyeong recalls a time when King Jeongjo visited her in 1758, this time to discuss a confrontation he had had with Sado. He ordered the crown prince to confess his crimes, and Sado in tears explained how every time he was reprimanded by the king, he would fill with such a rage it could only be abated when he killed something. It could be anything, a chicken, a eunuch, it didn't matter. Only after he killed could he regain his senses. Hearing this, Lady Hyegyeong implored Jeongjo to show his son more affection, assuring him that Sado's true character was actually noble. The king promised her that he would do this, but when she told Sado, he chastised her. He was right. Neither man changed their ways, and they continued to drive each other to greater extremes. It's fitting that you can hear the magpies, the gachi. They play a role in the final scene that happened here by Moon Jong-jeon. The ultimate showdown happened on July 12, 1762. Jeongjo sent word that he was coming to Changgyeonggung and Sado should meet him. Lady Hyegyeong wrote that she had an intense foreboding that day, and it only became worse when she saw the magpies gathering in a large group and crying out in unison. She believed that Sado might kill her. He had grown increasingly violent and had struck her, causing bruises that made her hide her face from the court for a few days. She had spoken to his mother about her fears, and now Sado was summoning her to his chambers. First, she went to see their son and told him that whatever happened, he had to remain strong. When she got to Sado's chambers, which stood over here, she found him drained of energy. He told her that this would be the day he would die, but she would be spared, and that the malevolence she had used to save herself and their son filled him with fright. She wrote that he was so lucid that had he asked her to flee with him, she would have. Instead, Sado left her when the sound of King Jeongjo rapping his sword and yelling commands could no longer be ignored. The king was furious and ordered a rice chest brought from the kitchen. He commanded his only living son to get inside of it. At this point, the young Jeongjo, aged 10, rushed out of his quarters and begged his grandfather, the king, to forgive Sado. Jeongjo ordered him and Lady Hyegyeong to leave his sight. She hid behind a wall, like that one over there. Like the star she was in the biggest K-drama of all time, she banged her chest and wailed as she listened to her husband beg for mercy. No one came to her aid, presumably because her own fate was unknown. Finally, she was able to get a eunuch to take her hastily written request to Jeongjo. He allowed her to take Jeongjo out of the palace and take up residence at her father's house. In the end, the crown prince stripped off his royal robes and climbed into the rice chest. It was sealed shut, and he slowly succumbed to starvation after 8 sweltering summer days. Millions of people visit Elsinore Castle in Denmark to see the assumed setting of a fictional story. Here they can find the setting of a tragedy that is much more monumental and real than Hamlet. I wish more people were familiar with her side of the story. The 2015 Korean movie Sado stuck pretty close to Lady Hyegyeong's memoirs, but it was written like an extended version of Game of Thrones. In fact, the English title was The Throne. It would have been better, I think, to keep it as Sado, because that looked like sadomasochism, and there was a lot of sadomasochism going on in this story. Only one reenactment I know touches on the tragedy. It takes place here in Moon Jong-jeon. An angry King Jeongjo learns about the plot to get King Jeongjo to turn against Sado and reacts with rage. That narrative, the story of a would-be benevolent ruler betrayed by a selfish faction, is one that's common in a lot of Korean minds and tourist literature today. Lady Hyegyeong was an unreliable narrator at times for sure, but I can't believe that she made up her story. 100 years before Freud, she diagnosed textbook neuroses and their roots, OCD in her father-in-law, and in her husband, schizophrenia and vestrophobia. Who knew fear of clothing was a thing back then? How could she have made this stuff up? A Changgyeonggung guide gave a brilliant three-phase explanation of the tragedy. 1. Personality differences led to a conflict between Jeongjo and Sado. 2. These differences drove father and son apart and led to increasingly violent displays by Sado. And 3. Two rival court factions exploited the situation to pursue their goals. The first time I heard that a Korean king had his son entombed alive in a rice chest. A wooden rice chest like this one. I thought, these people are crazy. After reading Kim-Haboush's annotations, I now marvel at the whole family's cunning and anguish. I believe they deeply loved each other, but were pulled and trapped by uncontrollable forces. Since Sado was a royal, anyone, including the king, who physically harmed him could be charged with a crime. Had Sado himself been charged with murder and rape, his family could have been permanently banned from the court or even killed. Although tragic, his life and death enabled the Yi clan to retain power and pass the throne on to Jeongjo, one of the dynasty's most gifted rulers.